This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Part 1. The lie began long before anyone realized there would be a reckoning. On the morning of my graduation, sunlight poured across the old brick courtyard of Hawthorne University. Families gathered in clusters beneath blooming magnolia trees, laughing, hugging, taking photographs that would be framed and hung on walls for decades. Cameras flashed, champagne bottles popped somewhere in the distance. To everyone else, it was a celebration. To my family, it was supposed to be a quiet victory lap. My Uncle Richard stood near the front row of the ceremony seating, dressed in a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than my entire semester's textbooks. His smile looked perfect in photographs. Calm, confident, a pillar of the family. People trusted that smile. They always had. Beside him sat my mother, nervously adjusting the sleeves of her dress. My Aunt Patricia leaned over to whisper something that made them both laugh. From the outside, we looked like any proud family attending a graduation. But under the surface, something rotten had been festering for 3 years. 3 years since my grandfather died. 3 years since the reading of the will. 3 years since they all decided I was the villain. Back then, the lawyer had sat at the polished oak table while rain tapped against the office windows. My uncle's fingers drummed impatiently while the document was unfolded. Everyone expected the estate, Grandpa's house, his investments, the family land to go to Richard. After all, Richard had always said he was the responsible one. Then the lawyer cleared his throat and read the words that changed everything. The majority of the estate would go to me. Silence had filled the room like smoke. Then, the accusations began. They said I forged the will. They said I manipulated an old man in his final days. They said I had stolen what wasn't mine. My uncle's voice had been the loudest. Richard didn't shout. He never needed to. His calm certainty was worse. He simply explained to the room that I must have tampered with the documents, that I had everything to gain. And slowly, the rest of the family believed him. Within weeks, the whispers spread. Cousins stopped answering my messages. My aunt told people I had always been greedy. Even my own mother looked at me like she wasn't sure anymore. The will was contested. Lawyers got involved. Then, suddenly, a new document appeared. A corrected will. This one left everything to Richard. The court accepted it. Case closed. The family celebrated quietly while I stood alone outside the courthouse steps, watching the man who stole my grandfather's legacy shake hands with attorneys and smile for cameras. They thought they had buried the truth that day, and for 3 years, I let them believe it. Now the graduation ceremony began. Rows of students filed toward the stage while the crowd applauded politely. My name would be called soon. My uncle sat there confidently, unaware that today was not just a graduation. It was the day his life would begin to unravel. Because 3 nights ago, while cleaning out the last storage boxes from Grandpa's old house, I found something none of them knew existed. A small black flash drive. And on it, a video my grandfather recorded 2 weeks before he died. A video that proved everything. Part 2. The flash drive was hidden in a place no one had bothered to check. 3 nights before graduation, I was standing alone inside my grandfather's house for what was supposed to be the last time. The real estate agent had already placed a discreet sign out front. Soon strangers would walk through the rooms where my childhood memories lived. The house technically belonged to my uncle now, but he had been too busy to clear out the attic himself, so he sent me. It was almost poetic. The man who stole the house asked the person he accused of forgery to pack the final boxes. Dust floated through narrow beams of light as I pushed open the attic door. The air smelled like old wood and forgotten winters. Cardboard boxes were stacked along the slanted walls, each labeled in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Taxes, old photos, war letters. I worked quietly, sorting through decades of life that no one else seemed to care about. Most of it would be donated or thrown away. The family had already taken anything valuable. or at least they thought they had. After 2 hours, I reached the final corner of the attic where an old cedar chest sat beneath a faded blanket. I remembered that chest. Grandpa used to keep fishing gear in it when I was a kid. The hinges creaked when I lifted the lid. Inside were photographs, old newspapers, and a wooden box I had never seen before. It was small, no bigger than a paperback novel, with a brass latch. For some reason, my heart started beating faster. I opened it. Inside was a single flash drive. Just one. At first, I assumed it was nothing important, maybe old family photos he had backed up, but something about the way it was stored made me hesitate. My grandfather had always been organized, careful, intentional. He didn't hide things without a reason. I turned the drive over in my hand. A small strip of masking tape had been attached to it. In faded blue ink were 2 words. For Daniel. My name. The silence in the attic suddenly felt heavier. I carried the box downstairs and plugged the flash drive into my laptop on the kitchen table. The screen lit up, showing only one file. A video. The timestamp said it had been recorded 16 days before my grandfather passed away. My hands hovered over the trackpad for a long moment before I finally clicked play. The video opened with a shaky frame, like someone adjusting a camera. Then the image settled. My grandfather appeared on the screen, sitting in his favorite leather chair in the living room. The same chair that still sat 10 feet away from me. Seeing him again after 3 years made something tighten in my chest. He looked thinner than I remembered, but his eyes were sharp, clear, very much himself. He leaned forward slightly and spoke directly into the camera. Daniel, if you are watching this, then it means something has gone wrong. My pulse quickened. Your uncle will try to take everything. I know him better than the rest of this family does. I stopped breathing. The old man continued calmly, like someone recording instructions for the future. I have already signed my will with the lawyer, but Richard believes he deserves this house, the land, and the investments. If he cannot get them honestly, he will try something else. The room felt suddenly colder. So I made this recording in case the documents are ever changed. Then my grandfather leaned back, folded his hands, and said something that made my stomach drop. Because if you are seeing this, Daniel, it means Richard has already forged the will. I stared at the screen in disbelief. But the next thing my grandfather did was even worse for my uncle. He reached beside the chair and held up a document toward the camera, and behind it, there was someone else standing in the room. Someone my uncle would never expect. Part 3. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The video had paused automatically after a brief glitch in the recording. On the screen, my grandfather held a document toward the camera, clearly a copy of the original will. But that wasn't what made my pulse spike. It was the figure standing behind him. Partially out of frame, slightly blurred, but unmistakable. The lawyer. Not just any lawyer either. I recognized him immediately. Thomas Keller, the same estate attorney who had presided over the reading of the will 3 years earlier. The man who had calmly announced that my grandfather left everything to me, before the corrected document mysteriously appeared weeks later. My uncle's lawyer. Or at least, that's what he had become. My fingers trembled slightly as I rewound the video. The scene replayed. My grandfather adjusted the paper and spoke again, his voice steady, despite the faint rasp of illness in his throat. This is the signed will dated May 14th. Everything in it reflects my final decision. Daniel receives the house, the land, and the majority of my investments, not because he asked for it, but because he earned my trust. Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting from somewhere deep in my chest. For 3 years, my family had acted as if I manipulated him, as if I whispered into the ear of a dying man to steal what wasn't mine. But here he was, speaking clearly, deliberately. Then he gestured slightly behind him. Thomas Keller is here as a witness to this recording. He handled the paperwork himself. The lawyer stepped forward into frame. 3 years ago, when the will was contested, Keller had looked completely composed, polished, professional. He had spoken in slow, careful sentences about the legal validity of the revised document. Now on the screen, he looked different, less confident. You could see it in his eyes, like a man standing somewhere he wasn't supposed to be. My grandfather continued, "If anything happens to this document after my death, this recording should make it clear what my intentions were." The camera shifted slightly as if someone had bumped the tripod. Then Keller spoke, just a few quiet words. "Yes, I confirm, Mr. Whitaker signed the will willingly. I witnessed the signature myself. My heart started racing. That single sentence could destroy everything my uncle built, because in court 3 years ago, Keller had claimed the opposite. He testified that my grandfather appeared confused in his final weeks, that a second document, one that left the estate to Richard, had replaced the earlier will. The same man, two completely different stories. And now there was proof." The video continued for another minute. My grandfather spoke directly to me again. "Daniel, if the family turns against you after I'm gone, remember something. Truth has a strange way of waiting for the right moment." He smiled slightly, the same patient smile he used when teaching me to fish when I was 10. "Don't rush. Just wait." The recording ended. The laptop screen went black. For several seconds, I just sat there in the quiet kitchen, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a car passing on the road outside. 3 years. 3 years of being treated like a criminal by my own relatives. 3 years of watching my uncle renovate this house like it belonged to him. 3 years of silence. I looked back down at the flash drive in my hand. My grandfather hadn't just left me evidence. He had left me timing. And suddenly, my graduation ceremony, something that was supposed to be a simple family celebration, started to look like the perfect stage. Because in less than 72 hours, my Uncle Richard would be sitting proudly in the audience, surrounded by the same family members who believed his version of the story. They would all be there, watching, smiling, completely unaware that the truth was about to walk across that stage with a diploma in one hand and a lawsuit in the other. Part 4. For 3 years, I had imagined confronting my family. In those late nights after court hearings, when the anger kept me awake, I pictured walking into a room and proving them all wrong in one dramatic moment. I imagined their faces when they realized what they had done. But reality rarely works like that. The truth usually arrives quietly, patiently, like a storm building beyond the horizon while everyone else keeps enjoying the sunshine. And now the storm was finally here. After watching the video 3 times that night, I sat at my kitchen table until nearly 3 in the morning, staring at the laptop screen and thinking through every possible outcome. The recording was powerful evidence, but it wasn't enough on its own. If I wanted justice, I needed more than revenge. I needed a strategy. By sunrise, I knew exactly who I needed to call. Her name was Laura Bennett. 3 years earlier, when the will dispute first began, she had been the only attorney who didn't treat me like I was already guilty. Back then, I couldn't afford to hire her properly, and the case moved too quickly before the corrected will appeared. Once the court accepted that document, the fight was essentially over, or so everyone believed. When Laura answered the phone that morning, her voice sounded surprised. I hadn't contacted her since the day we lost the case. I didn't explain everything over the phone. Instead, I asked if I could meet her that afternoon. 2 hours later, I sat across from her desk while she watched the video. The office was silent, except for my grandfather's voice playing through the laptop speakers. Laura leaned forward slowly, elbows resting on the desk. Her expression didn't change much while the video played, but I noticed the way her eyes sharpened when the lawyer appeared on screen. When the recording ended, she replayed the final minute again. Then she closed the laptop and looked at me. For several seconds, she said nothing. Finally, she exhaled softly. "Where did you get this?" I explained about the attic, the wooden box, the flash drive with my name on it. Laura leaned back in her chair, clearly thinking through the legal implications. Then she said something that made my pulse quicken. If this video is authentic, and it appears to be, your uncle didn't just manipulate the estate, he committed fraud. The word hung in the air between us. Fraud in estate cases isn't just a family dispute. It's a legal nightmare. If someone intentionally replaces a valid will with a forged one, the consequences can unravel years of financial decisions. Property transfers, investment accounts, tax filings. Every piece of the estate could suddenly become invalid. Laura opened her laptop and began typing quickly. How long until your graduation ceremony? 2 days. She nodded slowly. Good. I blinked in surprise. Good. She looked up at me with a small, calculating smile. Because your uncle believes the story is finished. He thinks the court already decided everything, which means he won't see what's coming. My heart started pounding again. Laura continued typing. First, we verify the video's authenticity. That part will be easy. The file metadata alone will show the recording date. Then we subpoena Keller, the lawyer in the video. If he denies it, we present the recording. If he admits it, the case becomes explosive. I imagine my uncle's calm smile from earlier that morning as he stood in the graduation seating area. He truly believed he had won. Laura closed her laptop again and folded her hands. Daniel, if we do this correctly, we won't just reopen the case. We can sue for damages. Every dollar transferred from the estate, every profit your uncle made from selling property, even legal fees from the original trial. My throat felt suddenly dry. How much are we talking about? Laura met my eyes calmly. Everything. The word echoed in my head. Everything. For the first time in 3 years, the balance of power had shifted. My uncle thought he buried the truth when he replaced that will. But now there was something he didn't know existed. A video, a witness, and a lawsuit that was about to follow him straight into the middle of a graduation celebration he thought was about honoring me, when in reality, it was the opening scene of his downfall. Part 5. By the morning of my graduation, the plan was already in motion. The campus buzzed with celebration. Rows of white folding chairs stretched across the courtyard lawn, slowly filling with proud families dressed in summer colors. The university orchestra tuned their instruments near the stage while staff members adjusted microphones and banners. To everyone else, it looked like an ordinary commencement ceremony. But for me, every small detail felt strangely sharp, like the world had shifted into a higher resolution. I noticed things I normally wouldn't. The way sunlight reflected off the brass railings of the stage, the nervous excitement in the voices of students adjusting their caps, and across the seating area, the calm confidence of a man who believed he had nothing to fear. My Uncle Richard. He stood near the center aisle speaking to 2 distant cousins who had traveled in for the ceremony. His posture was relaxed, shoulders back, hands casually in his pockets. If someone had taken a photograph at that moment, he would have looked like the picture of family pride. The successful uncle celebrating his nephew's graduation. I watched him from a distance for a moment. 3 years ago, after the court accepted the forged will, he had quietly sold 2 pieces of my grandfather's land. The money funded renovations to this very house and expanded his investment portfolio. On paper, everything looked legal. But if the will was invalid, every transaction could be reversed. Every dollar could be reclaimed. Laura had explained it clearly the night before. Fraud doesn't just erase the original lie, it forces the court to unwind everything built on top of it. And my uncle had built a lot. The thought almost made me smile. My phone vibrated gently in my pocket. A message from Laura. Everything is ready. I typed a quick reply. So are they. I slipped the phone away just as my name was called for lineup. The graduates began gathering behind the stage in alphabetical order. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass and sunscreen as nervous conversations buzzed around me. Some students talked about job offers, others about moving to new cities. For a moment, I wondered what my life might have looked like if the past 3 years had gone differently, if my family hadn't turned against me, if my uncle hadn't replaced that will. But then I remembered something my grandfather said in the video. Truth has a strange way of waiting for the right moment. Maybe this was the moment he had in mind. The ceremony began with the usual speeches. The university president talked about perseverance and future opportunities. A guest speaker delivered a long story about innovation and courage. I barely heard any of it. My eyes kept drifting toward the audience. My uncle sat comfortably between my mother and Aunt Patricia. Every so often, he checked his phone, likely answering messages from business partners congratulating him for attending the ceremony. He had no idea that another kind of message was already waiting for him. Laura had filed the lawsuit that morning. Not next week. Not after the ceremony, that morning. By the time the final graduates walked across the stage, the legal paperwork would already be moving through the system. Subpoenas prepared, financial records requested, witness testimony scheduled. The machine had started turning, and there was no way to stop it now. Finally, the announcer began calling students to receive their diplomas. The line moved slowly toward the stage steps. My heartbeat quickened as I approached the front. When my name echoed across the courtyard, applause rose politely from the crowd. I stepped onto the stage, shook the dean's hand, and accepted the diploma case. From the corner of my eye, I glanced toward the audience. My uncle clapped casually like everyone else. Proud, relaxed, completely unaware that while he applauded my graduation, a court clerk across town had just stamped a lawsuit demanding the return of every dollar he took from my grandfather's estate. And before the day was over, he was going to find out. Part 6. The applause faded as I stepped off the stage, diploma still warm in my hands. Graduates continued walking across after me, each receiving their moment of celebration while cameras flashed and families cheered. From a distance, it looked like the happiest day of our lives, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Because at that exact moment, about 2 miles away in a quiet government building, a process server was walking toward a polished office door with a thick envelope in his hand. Inside that envelope was the lawsuit, and printed on the first page was my uncle's name. I didn't know the exact minute it would happen, but Laura had told me the plan. Richard Whitaker ran his business from the top floor of a glass office tower downtown. His assistant would accept the documents, the server would confirm the delivery, and from that moment forward, the legal clock would start ticking. Once he opened the envelope, everything would change. But here in the courtyard, the ceremony still continued. The orchestra played a soft piece while the final rows of students waited their turn. I sat down in the graduate section, adjusting the uncomfortable cap on my head while pretending to watch the stage. Across the lawn, my family was talking among themselves. My Aunt Patricia leaned toward my uncle, clearly telling a story. My mother listened quietly, occasionally glancing in my direction with an uncertain expression. Even now, after 3 years, she still didn't fully know what to believe. And Richard sat there calmly between them. For a moment, I wondered what was happening inside his office. Maybe his assistant had already signed for the envelope. Maybe it was sitting on his desk right now. Or maybe my phone buzzed. A single message from Laura appeared on the screen. Delivered. I felt a strange calm wash over me. It had started. I looked up toward the audience again. My uncle was still smiling politely as another graduate crossed the stage, but suddenly his phone vibrated in his hand. I saw him glance down at the screen. His expression barely changed at first, just a slight tightening around his eyes. He read the message once, then again. Patricia noticed something and leaned closer to him, asking what was wrong. He shook his head quickly and slipped the phone back into his pocket. From the outside, no one would have noticed anything unusual. But I did, because Richard Whitaker had always been a man who controlled every situation around him. And for the first time in 3 years, Something had slipped out of his control. The ceremony continued for another 20 minutes. Speeches ended, degrees were awarded. Finally, the university president announced the official closing of the commencement. The crowd erupted into applause as families stood and began gathering their graduates. Students rushed toward the seating area, laughing and hugging relatives. Cameras flashed everywhere. I walked calmly toward my family. My mother reached me first, pulling me into a tight embrace. "Congratulations, Daniel. I'm proud of you." Her voice carried both warmth and hesitation. Patricia followed with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Our graduate! Look at you!" Then my uncle stepped forward. His smile had returned, but something behind his eyes looked slightly different now. More alert, more careful. He extended his hand. "Congratulations, Daniel." I shook it. His grip was firm, but I could feel tension in his fingers. Maybe he had already read the lawsuit, or maybe he was still trying to convince himself the message on his phone meant something else. For a moment, we stood there surrounded by laughing families and celebration. Then Richard leaned slightly closer to me and spoke quietly. "I got an interesting email just now." I met his gaze calmly. "Did you?" He studied my face carefully. "Apparently someone is accusing me of forging your grandfather's will." There was a pause. The courtyard noise faded into the background. I tilted my head slightly. "That does sound serious." His smile thinned. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" For 3 years, he had asked that question with complete confidence, but this time was different because now there was something he didn't know about yet. The video. And very soon, everyone else was going to see it. Part 7. My uncle studied my face carefully, waiting for the reaction he had seen so many times before. For 3 years, that question had always cornered me. "You wouldn't know anything about that, would you?" Back then, the accusation had weight behind it. Lawyers, court documents, family members whispering behind closed doors. Every time he asked it, he knew the answer didn't matter because the narrative already belonged to him. But now the situation was different. Now he was the one searching for certainty, and for the first time, I didn't give him the reaction he expected. I simply smiled, not a wide smile, just enough to make him notice. Around us, the courtyard buzzed with celebration. Parents hugged their children, graduates posed for photos beneath the university banners. Someone nearby opened a bottle of champagne, and the cork popped loudly into the air. But in the small circle between my uncle and me, the atmosphere had shifted. He noticed it. People like Richard Whitaker always notice when control begins to slip. "You're smiling," he said quietly. I shrugged. "It's graduation day." That didn't satisfy him. Behind him, my Aunt Patricia was busy arranging a group photo with several cousins. My mother stood a few steps away, talking politely with another family whose son had just graduated. No one was paying attention to us, which meant my uncle could speak more freely. He leaned closer. "You should be careful about playing games with legal matters, Daniel." The tone was still calm, but the warmth had disappeared. False accusations can have consequences. I nodded slowly. "You're right." For a brief second, confusion crossed his face. He clearly expected resistance, anger, something emotional. Instead, I gave him calm agreement, and that made him uneasy. Richard adjusted his jacket sleeve, a small, nervous habit I remembered from childhood. He only did it when something bothered him. "The email said a lawsuit has been filed," he continued. "Fraud, estate manipulation, a very serious claim." I tilted my head slightly. "Sounds like whoever filed it must have strong evidence." His eyes narrowed. "Do they?" I let a moment pass before answering. "I think so." That was the first crack, a tiny shift in his expression, barely visible to anyone else. But I saw it clearly, because suddenly he wasn't sure anymore. The confidence he carried for 3 years depended on one assumption, that the forged will was the only version anyone could prove. Without evidence, accusations were just noise. But if evidence existed, the entire structure he built could collapse. Patricia called out from behind us. "Richard, come here, we're taking pictures." He glanced over his shoulder, then back at me. "This conversation isn't over," he said quietly. I nodded. "No, it's just getting started." For a long moment, we looked at each other. Then he turned and walked toward the group photo. From a distance, it looked perfectly normal. My family gathered together beneath a large oak tree while someone raised a camera. Arms wrapped around shoulders, smiles wide and practiced. My uncle stood at the center, the successful businessman, the proud relative, the man who believed he had secured my grandfather's entire estate. Click. The camera captured the moment forever. What none of them realized was that the picture had just frozen the final seconds before everything began to unravel. Because later that afternoon, while they celebrated over lunch, my lawyer would file the next motion in court, and attached to that motion would be a single piece of digital evidence, a video recording, one that showed my grandfather clearly stating the truth, one that included a witness my uncle never expected. And once the judge saw it, the question wouldn't be whether Richard Whittaker forged the will. The question would be how much of my grandfather's fortune he had already spent, and how many pennies he would be forced to return. Part 8. The celebration lunch took place at a restaurant my uncle liked to brag about. It sat on the corner of a quiet downtown street, the kind of place with tall windows, polished wood tables, and servers who spoke in calm, practiced voices. My uncle had chosen it weeks earlier, telling everyone a graduation deserved something a little more special. In reality, Richard Whittaker liked places where people could see him. Status mattered to him. As our group arrived, the hostess greeted him by name. He nodded confidently, like a man who had eaten there many times before. The rest of the family followed him toward a long table near the window. From the outside, nothing about the lunch looked unusual. My Aunt Patricia laughed loudly while flipping through the photos on her phone from the ceremony. My mother kept touching my arm, like she still couldn't believe I had actually graduated. Even my cousins relaxed as the first round of drinks arrived. But Richard was different now. Subtle changes, small enough that most people wouldn't notice. He checked his phone more often. He responded to messages quickly. Once or twice, he stepped away from the table to make a short call near the entrance. Each time he returned, the calm smile returned with him, but it was thinner than before. The lawsuit had reached him. What he didn't know yet was how serious it really was. I watched quietly while the waiter brought appetizers. Conversation flowed easily around the table, until my uncle finally looked directly at me again. "So Daniel," he said, swirling a glass of water slowly, "have you decided what you're doing after graduation?" The question sounded casual, but I recognized the strategy. Redirect attention, change the subject, reassert normalcy. Classic Richard. I leaned back slightly. "Actually, yes." Several heads turned toward me. Patricia smiled. "Oh good, a job already?" Something like that. Richard watched me carefully now. "And what exactly is that?" I met his gaze. "I'm working with a lawyer." The table went quiet. Patricia laughed lightly, assuming it was a joke. "A lawyer? For what?" I didn't answer her. My attention stayed on Richard. His fingers had stopped moving on the table. I continued calmly. "We're reviewing some estate records." The word estate landed heavily. My mother looked confused. "Estate? What estate?" Before I could answer, Richard set his glass down slowly. "Daniel," he said in a measured voice, "this really isn't the place for that conversation." Maybe not. But the moment had already shifted, because something else had just happened across town. In a quiet courthouse office, Laura had submitted the second filing in the case. This one included the video. The clerk processed the document, scanned the file, and entered it into the court system. Within minutes, Richard's legal team would receive notification, which meant the next phone call he received wouldn't be from an assistant, it would be from his lawyer. And that lawyer would have one very important question. Where did this video come from? Back at the restaurant, the waiter arrived with the main dishes. Plates were placed carefully in front of each person. The conversation tried to restart, but something invisible now sat at the center of the table. attention. Richard's phone buzzed again. This time he looked at the screen for longer, much longer. His jaw tightened slightly. He stood up. "Excuse me." No one stopped him as he walked quickly toward the entrance. Through the glass window, I could see him outside on the sidewalk answering the call. His posture was rigid now, listening, then speaking, then listening again. And even from across the restaurant, I could see the exact moment his confidence finally cracked. Because suddenly his calm expression disappeared, and in its place was disbelief. Part 9. From inside the restaurant, the conversation around the table continued in awkward fragments. My Aunt Patricia tried to keep things light by commenting on the food. One of my cousins showed photos from the ceremony again. My mother asked me about job applications, though her attention kept drifting toward the front window. Everyone noticed Richard's absence. No one said it directly, but the energy at the table had shifted. Outside on the sidewalk, my uncle stood frozen with his phone pressed against his ear. Cars passed on the street behind him, but he didn't seem to notice. I watched him carefully. Even through the glass, his body language told the entire story. At first, he listened silently. Then he started talking, short, controlled sentences. Then suddenly he stopped speaking again. His shoulders stiffened. His free hand moved to his forehead. That was when I knew his lawyer had reached the part of the conversation about the video, because Richard Whitaker had spent his entire career believing he understood risk, business deals, investment strategies, contract negotiations. He always believed he was the smartest person in the room, but the one thing he never planned for was evidence he didn't know existed. My aunt finally leaned toward me. "Do you know what that call is about?" Her tone was casual, but curiosity flickered in her eyes. I shrugged slightly. "Probably business." Across the table, my mother looked uneasy. "Richard has been acting strange since the ceremony." I didn't respond. Outside, my uncle started pacing slowly along the sidewalk while speaking into the phone. The calm businessman image was gone now. His movements were sharper, faster. At one point, he turned abruptly and stared directly through the restaurant window. Our eyes met. Even from that distance, I could see the question forming in his mind. How? That was the part he couldn't understand, because from his perspective, the forged will had been perfect. His lawyer testified. The court accepted the revised document. The estate transferred legally. Everything was sealed and finished. For 3 years, nothing challenged that version of reality. Until today. Until a court filing appeared with a video attached. A video recorded by the man he thought he had outmaneuvered. My uncle ended the call suddenly. For a moment, he stood still on the sidewalk, staring down at his phone screen, like he expected the information to change if he looked long enough. Then he walked back toward the restaurant. Inside, conversation died almost immediately when he returned to the table. He didn't sit right away. Instead, he looked directly at me. Something new had appeared in his expression. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. "Where did you get it?" The question was quiet, but sharp enough to cut through every other sound in the room. My aunt blinked in confusion. "Get what?" Richard didn't answer her. His eyes never left mine. "The video," he said. Several people around the table shifted uncomfortably. My mother looked between us. "Video? What video?" I folded my hands calmly on the table. "You'll see it soon enough." Richard pulled out his chair slowly and sat down. His jaw tightened. "You broke into the house, didn't you?" I almost laughed. It's funny hearing that from the man who replaced a legal will. Patricia gasped softly. "What?" My mother turned pale. "Daniel." But Richard raised one hand, stopping the conversation before it could spiral further. His voice returned to that controlled tone he used in business meetings. "You're making a serious accusation." I met his gaze. "So is the lawsuit." The word lawsuit hit the table like a dropped glass. Patricia looked horrified. "There's a lawsuit?" My uncle leaned forward slightly, studying me with the focus of someone recalculating a situation. For 3 years, he had treated me like a nuisance. Now he was forced to consider something else. The possibility that the quiet nephew he dismissed had just become the biggest legal threat he had ever faced. And the worst part for him, this was only the beginning. Part 10. The table went completely silent. Even the soft background music in the restaurant suddenly felt louder, like someone had turned up the volume on the entire room. My Aunt Patricia looked from my uncle to me, her mouth slightly open. "A lawsuit?" she repeated. My mother's face had lost all color. "Daniel, what is he talking about?" Richard still hadn't taken his eyes off me. He leaned back slowly in his chair, fingers steepled together in front of him like a man evaluating a negotiation. Except this time, the negotiation wasn't happening in a boardroom. It was happening at a graduation lunch. "You filed a lawsuit against me," he said calmly. I nodded once. "Yes." Patricia let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "Oh, come on, Daniel. That's not funny." No one joined her. Because Richard wasn't laughing. His lawyer had clearly told him enough on the phone to know the situation was real. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" he asked. The way he said it, calm, almost polite, would have fooled anyone who didn't know him well. But I had grown up watching this man negotiate business deals at family gatherings. I recognized the tone. He was gathering information, buying time. I answered simply, "Forgery." The word landed heavily. My mother shook her head immediately. "No, that's ridiculous." But Patricia looked less certain now. Richard kept his expression steady. "Forgery of what? You know exactly what. The will." Across the table, Patricia's fork clattered softly against her plate. Richard turned his head slightly toward her. "Patricia, please." But she was already staring at me. "Daniel, the court settled that years ago." "Yes, it did." My uncle's eyes sharpened. "Then why bring it up again?" I held his gaze. "Because the court didn't have all the information." For a moment, no one spoke. Then my mother asked the question everyone else was thinking. "What information?" I reached into my jacket pocket and placed my phone gently on the table. The screen lit up as I tapped it once. My uncle watched the movement carefully. "Is that supposed to intimidate me?" "Not at all." I rotated the phone so the screen faced him. It was paused on a single frame, a video still. My grandfather sitting in his leather chair. Richard's calm expression froze. For a split second, barely visible, his eyes widened. Then he looked up at me again. "Where did you get that?" The same question he had asked outside the restaurant. But this time the rest of the family had seen the image. Patricia leaned closer to look. "Is that Dad?" My mother's voice trembled slightly. That looks like your grandfather's living room." I nodded. "It is." Richard's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "That proves nothing." I tapped the screen again. The video didn't play yet, but the timestamp appeared clearly beneath the paused frame. Recorded 16 days before his death. Patricia frowned. "Why would he be recording himself?" Richard answered quickly. "People record things all the time," but his voice had lost a little of its confidence. My mother looked at me again. "Daniel, what is this?" I kept my tone calm. "It's a message Grandpa left. For me." The tension around the table thickened. Richard leaned forward again. "And you think that changes anything?" I held his gaze. "I know it does." For a moment, neither of us moved. Then his phone buzzed again on the table. He glanced at it quickly. His lawyer. I could tell from the name flashing on the screen. Richard looked back at me one more time before answering. "This isn't over," he said quietly. I nodded. "No, it's really just getting started." He stood and walked toward the restaurant entrance again, answering the call before the door even closed behind him. Inside the restaurant, my family stared at me. My mother's voice was barely above a whisper. "Daniel, what did your grandfather say in that video?" I looked down at the paused frame on my phone, then back toward the door where my uncle had just disappeared. "The truth," I said, "and once the court hears it, he's going to owe me every penny he took." Part 11. The restaurant felt smaller after that. Not physically smaller, but the space around our table seemed to tighten, like the air itself had grown heavier. Conversations from other diners blurred into a low hum. while the attention of my entire family remained fixed on the phone sitting in front of me. My mother stared at the screen as if the image of her father might suddenly speak. Patricia looked more unsettled than I had ever seen her. "Daniel," she said slowly, "are you serious about this?" I didn't answer right away. Through the window, I could still see my uncle outside on the sidewalk. His voice carried faintly through the glass as he spoke sharply into the phone. Whatever his lawyer was saying now clearly wasn't helping his mood. Patricia followed my gaze. "Is Richard really being sued?" "Yes." The word landed with a quiet finality. My mother rubbed her hands together nervously. "But why now?" she asked. "If there was evidence, why didn't you show it before?" "Because I didn't have it before." Both women looked back at the phone. Patricia leaned closer. "Your grandfather made that recording?" 16 days before he died." My mother swallowed. "And what does he say?" The question hung between us. For 3 years, my family had lived inside a single story, that I manipulated an old man, changed his will, and tried to steal what belonged to someone else. Now that story was cracking open. I tapped the phone screen again, but instead of playing the video, I locked the display and slipped it back into my pocket. Patricia blinked in surprise. "You're not going to show us?" "Not yet." "Why not?" "Because the first place it needs to be shown is court." My mother looked pained. "Daniel, we're your family." I met her eyes gently. That didn't stop everyone from believing I was a criminal 3 years ago. She looked away. Patricia sighed and leaned back in her chair. "This is insane." Across the table, one of my cousins spoke up for the first time. "Wait, if Richard really forged the will, what happens?" The legal reality settled slowly over the group. I answered calmly. "Everything goes back to the original estate distribution." Patricia's eyes widened slightly. "Everything?" "Yes. The house, the land, the investments. My uncle had sold part of the farmland 2 years earlier to a development company. That deal alone was worth several $1,000,000. If the will was proven fraudulent, that money would become part of the lawsuit." Patricia whispered almost to herself, "Oh my God." Through the window, Richard ended his phone call again. This time he didn't pace. He stood perfectly still for several seconds, staring down the street like a man trying to solve an impossible equation. Then he looked up and met my gaze through the glass. There was no confusion in his expression now, only calculation. The moment he walked back inside, every conversation at the table died. He pulled out his chair slowly and sat down. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but firm. "Daniel." "Yes?" "My lawyer says you submitted a video recording to the court." "That's correct." Patricia looked between us nervously. "Richard, what is going on?" He didn't answer her. Instead, he leaned forward slightly toward me. "You're claiming this video proves I forged the will." I nodded. "That's what it shows." He studied my face carefully. Then, for the first time since the lawsuit began, he smiled. But it wasn't the confident smile he used in public. It was colder, sharper, almost amused. "You really think a single video is enough to destroy 3 years of legal rulings?" I held his gaze. "You haven't seen the whole thing yet." His smile lingered for another moment. Then he said something that made everyone at the table freeze. "Neither have you." The words hung there, heavy and dangerous. Because in that instant, I realized something. My uncle wasn't reacting like a man who had just been exposed. He was reacting like someone who believed the story still had another twist left. And whatever he thought he knew, he clearly believed it could still save him. Part 12. For a moment, no one spoke. My uncle's last sentence sat on the table like an unexploded device. "Neither have you." Patricia looked from him to me, completely lost. What does that even mean? Richard leaned back in his chair again, folding his hands together calmly. The cold smile still lingered at the corner of his mouth, but now there was something else behind it. Confidence. Not the loud, arrogant confidence he usually displayed. Something quieter. Something dangerous. My mother looked confused. "Richard, if there's a video..." He raised a hand slightly. "Let's not jump to conclusions." His eyes moved back to me. Daniel believes he found something important. I watched him carefully now. 3 years ago, when the forged will appeared, I had seen this same expression during the court hearings. Richard always acted like the outcome had already been decided long before anyone else entered the room. He liked being 5 steps ahead, but this time, I had the video. Didn't I? Patricia frowned. But you said the lawyer called you about it. Yes, and according to them, Richard continued calmly, the video shows Dad sitting in his chair talking about his will. I didn't react, because that part was true. But Richard's next words landed slowly, deliberately, and apparently he says I plan to change it. Patricia blinked. That sounds bad. My uncle shrugged lightly. It sounds like a story. My mother looked between us again. Daniel, does the video actually prove anything? I opened my mouth to answer, but Richard spoke first, because here's the interesting part. He leaned forward slightly. My lawyer told me something else about that recording. I felt a faint chill creep up my spine. What? Richard held my gaze steadily. The video cuts off. The words settled slowly into the room. Patricia frowned again. Cuts off? Yes. According to the court filing, it ends shortly after Dad shows the document. My pulse quickened slightly. Because he was right. The video ended after my grandfather finished speaking to me. I had assumed that was the entire recording. Richard continued speaking carefully now, which means there is no proof of any forgery. Patricia looked relieved, so that's it? But I didn't share her relief because my uncle wasn't finished yet. He turned to me again. Daniel, do you know why recordings sometimes stop early? I didn't answer. He answered for me. Because the person filming turns the camera off. Patricia frowned again. So? Richard's voice dropped slightly, or because someone edited the file. My mother's eyes widened. Edited? Richard nodded slowly. Digital files are very easy to manipulate. The implications spread across the table like a shadow. Patricia looked back at me now, uncertainty creeping into her expression. Daniel, you didn't change anything, did you? I felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the group shift toward me. Richard leaned back again, watching silently. This was his counterattack. If he could convince them the video might be manipulated, then the entire accusation could collapse. And suddenly I understood what he meant earlier. Neither have you. He believed the video had weaknesses, gaps, places where doubt could grow. And if there's one thing my uncle understood better than anyone, it was how to turn doubt into victory. The waiter returned quietly to refill water glasses, sensing the tension but wisely saying nothing. Outside, traffic moved slowly past the restaurant windows. Inside, the future of my grandfather's estate hung in the balance of a single piece of evidence. Finally, my mother asked softly, Daniel, is the video complete? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked directly at Richard. He was watching me carefully now, waiting, because he believed he had found the flaw. But there was something he still didn't know, something I hadn't mentioned yet. I reached slowly into my jacket pocket again, and this time, I pulled out the flash drive. Part 13. The flash drive was small. So small, in fact, that Patricia leaned forward slightly just to see what I had placed on the table. It rested there between the plates and glasses, an ordinary black piece of plastic that could easily be mistaken for something unimportant. But everyone at the table understood immediately that it wasn't ordinary. My uncle's eyes dropped to it. For the first time since the conversation began, the cold confidence in his expression shifted, just slightly. "What's that?" Patricia asked. I didn't answer her right away. Instead, I slid the flash drive gently across the table until it stopped a few inches from Richard's hand. The original. The words were simple, but they landed with precision. Richard didn't touch it. His gaze stayed fixed on the drive like a man looking at something that might explode. My mother spoke quietly. "Daniel, that's the video?" I nodded. The only copy my grandfather left. Patricia looked confused again. "But you showed it to the court already, right?" "Yes." "Then why?" Richard interrupted her. "Because he thinks it proves something." His voice was calm again, but now there was a sharper edge underneath it. He finally reached forward and picked up the drive, turning it slowly between his fingers. Small, ordinary, innocent looking. Digital files are very easy to alter, he said. I met his gaze. So are legal testimonies. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. Richard ignored the comment. He held the drive up slightly. And you're claiming this contains the full recording? Yes. His eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting. My mother looked increasingly nervous. Why is this turning into a courtroom conversation at lunch? No one answered her, because the courtroom had already arrived. Richard set the flash drive back down. You know what happens next, don't you? I nodded. Discovery. The legal process where both sides exchange evidence. Every document, every file, every piece of information connected to the case. My uncle folded his hands again, which means your lawyer will have to provide the full video file. Correct. His lips curved slightly, and my legal team will analyze it, frame by frame, metadata, file structure, everything. I watched him carefully. He was rebuilding confidence now, because if he could prove the video had been edited, the accusation would collapse, and worse, it could make me look like the one manipulating evidence. Patricia whispered, "This is insane." My mother looked almost frightened now. "Daniel, are you sure about this?" I answered calmly. "Very sure." Richard studied me for another long moment. Then he leaned forward again. "Tell me something, Daniel. What? Why wait until now?" The question hung in the air. For 3 years I had said nothing. 3 years of silence. Why break it today? I glanced briefly at my graduation cap sitting on the empty chair beside me, because Grandpa told me to wait. Richard blinked. What? He said the truth would find the right moment. My uncle's expression hardened slightly. And you believe that moment is now? I nodded. Yes. He leaned back again. Then he said something quietly that only I was meant to hear. You're gambling everything on a video. I answered just as quietly. You gambled everything on a lie. The two sentences hung between us like a challenge. Around the table, the rest of the family sat frozen in uncertainty. They didn't know who to believe anymore. 3 years ago, the court had chosen Richard's story. Now, a new version of events was emerging. And the final decision wouldn't happen in this restaurant. It would happen in a courtroom, with lawyers, evidence, witnesses, and a judge who would eventually watch that video from beginning to end. My uncle pushed his chair back slowly and stood. Lunch is over, he said. Patricia looked startled. We haven't even. But Richard was already putting on his jacket. He looked down at the flash drive one more time before sliding it gently back across the table toward me. Keep it safe, Daniel. I picked it up. I planned to. Our eyes met again. And in that moment, I realized something important. Richard Whitaker was no longer dismissing the case. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't pretending the lawsuit was meaningless. Now he was preparing for war, and the first battle was about to begin in court. Part 14. The lawsuit spread through the family faster than I expected. By the next morning, my phone had already received 3 missed calls from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. 2 cousins sent cautious messages asking if the rumors were true. Someone even posted a vague comment on social media about family drama and inheritance fights. News travels fast when money is involved, especially when the money once belonged to someone everyone respected. My grandfather had been the quiet center of the family for decades. His house was where holidays happened, where birthdays were celebrated, where arguments ended over long dinners. After he died, that center disappeared, and my uncle had stepped into the empty space. Now that role was under threat. Across town, Laura's office had turned into the command center of the case. When I arrived that afternoon, her desk was already covered with documents, legal folders, and a laptop displaying several open windows. She barely looked up when I walked in. Good timing. That didn't sound casual. I sat down. Something happened. She turned the laptop toward me. Richard's legal team responded to the lawsuit. Already? That was fast. Laura nodded. Your uncle didn't waste any time hiring one of the most aggressive firms in the city. The name on the document belonged to a law group known for corporate litigation. people who handled high-stakes financial disputes, which meant my uncle was treating this very seriously. Laura tapped the screen. They're challenging the video. I leaned forward slightly. How? Standard approach. They claim the recording could be edited or manipulated, exactly what Richard hinted at during lunch. But Laura didn't seem worried. That's predictable, she continued. Every defense team attacks digital evidence first. She clicked another file open. The interesting part is this. The screen displayed a list of requests, document requests, subpoenas, financial disclosures. My uncle's lawyers were demanding access to every file connected to the video. Metadata, original storage location, device information, and they wanted something else. Laura pointed to a line near the bottom. The recording device. I frowned. The camera? Yes. They want to examine the hardware used to create the video. For a moment, I thought about the attic again. The wooden box, the old digital camera. My grandfather had left it with the flash drive. Laura leaned back in her chair. Do you still have it? Yes. Good. She nodded. That will make authentication much easier. Authentication, one of the most important steps in any evidence case. If the video could be proven genuine, my uncle's entire defense would collapse quickly. But if even a small doubt remained, the case could drag on for years. Laura folded her hands. Your uncle's team believes the video is incomplete. I thought about Richard's words at the restaurant. The video cuts off. So do you, apparently. Laura shrugged. They're not wrong. My grandfather's recording did end abruptly, which meant there was no direct footage of Richard altering the will. But Laura didn't seem concerned about that part. Fraud cases don't always require direct footage of the act itself, she explained. Intent and contradiction can be enough. She tapped another file open, especially when the same witness gives two completely different testimonies. The screen showed the name again. Thomas Keller, the estate lawyer, the man who appeared briefly in the video behind my grandfather, the same man who later testified in court that the will had been changed. Laura looked at me. We're subpoenaing him, my uncle's lawyer. Not exactly. She smiled slightly. Right now he's a witness, and witnesses have to answer questions. I imagine Keller sitting in a courtroom chair under oath, facing two versions of his own story, one spoken in court, one recorded on video. Laura continued typing. If Keller admits the video is real, the case shifts dramatically, and if he doesn't, then we show it to the judge. Simple. But lawsuits are never really simple. I leaned back in the chair. How long before the first hearing? Laura glanced at the calendar. 2 weeks. 2 weeks until the legal system officially reopened the question my family thought had been settled forever. Outside the office window, the city traffic moved slowly through the afternoon. Life continued normally for everyone else. But for Richard Whitaker, the countdown had already started. Because in 14 days, a courtroom would finally watch the video my grandfather recorded. And once that happened, the truth he buried for 3 years would step into the light. Part 15. The 2 weeks passed slower than I expected. Not because of the legal work. Laura and her team moved quickly, but because waiting has a strange way of stretching time. Every day seemed to last longer than it should. And during those days, my uncle began his counterattack. It started quietly. A phone call from Patricia one evening. She sounded hesitant. Daniel, your uncle says the lawsuit might hurt the whole family. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling of my apartment. How exactly? He says if the case drags on, legal costs could eat up the estate money. Interesting argument, because the estate money he referred to was money he had already taken. Patricia continued carefully. He also said, the video might not be what you think it is. Of course he did. I kept my voice calm. Did he explain why? Something about context. The word hung there awkwardly. Context. It sounded harmless enough, but in legal battles, context can change everything. I thanked her for the call and hung up. The next day, my mother visited. She sat at my kitchen table for nearly an hour, twisting her hands together nervously. Richard says you're being manipulated by that lawyer. Laura? Yes? He says lawyers love long cases because they get paid more. I almost smiled. It was a classic tactic. Make the conflict look like someone else's influence. Make the victim seem confused. Make the accused look reasonable. I asked her one simple question. Did he explain the video? She hesitated. No, but he says it doesn't show the whole story. There was that phrase again. Context. By the end of the week, the pressure increased. A cousin sent a message suggesting we settle the issue privately. Another relative asked if I would consider dropping the case to avoid embarrassing the family. Embarrassing. That word stuck with me, because for 3 years, no one worried about embarrassment when I was the one being accused. When I told Laura about the conversations, she nodded knowingly. He's preparing the ground. For what? For doubt. She explained it simply. If the family starts questioning the evidence before the court even sees it, it weakens your position emotionally. Emotionally? Yes. Juries and judges may rely on evidence, but people always bring emotions into the room. My uncle understood that, which meant he wasn't just fighting in court, he was fighting in the family. And then something else happened. 3 days before the hearing, Laura called me late in the evening. Her voice sounded sharper than usual. Daniel, we just received something from Richard's legal team. I sat up. What kind of something? A document. What does it say? She paused briefly. They claim there's another recording. The words hit me like cold water. Another recording? Yes. Laura continued carefully. According to their filing, your grandfather made multiple recordings discussing his will. I felt my pulse quicken. That didn't make sense. I searched the attic thoroughly. The flash drive only contained one file. What does the other recording say? Laura sighed. They didn't include it. Just the claim that it exists. I stood up and paced slowly across the room. Why would they say that if they don't have it? Because if the court believes there might be additional footage, the judge could delay the case until everything is found. Delay. That was the real goal. Time. Time to weaken the accusation. Time to create confusion. Time to reshape the story. I stopped pacing. Do you think they actually have another recording? Laura answered honestly. I don't know. Silence filled the room for a moment. Then she added one more thought. But if they're bluffing, we'll find out very soon. The hearing was only 3 days away, and suddenly the case was no longer just about the video I found. Now there might be another piece of the story, another recording, another message from my grandfather, or maybe another lie. Part 16. The night before the hearing, I went back to my grandfather's house. Technically, it no longer belonged to him. On paper, ownership had transferred to Richard 3 years earlier, along with the majority of the estate. But the place still felt like my grandfather's home in ways that legal documents couldn't erase. The old porch light flickered the same way it always had. The wind still moved through the tall oak tree beside the driveway, and the air carried that familiar quiet that used to make the house feel peaceful. Now it felt different, uncertain. I let myself in with the spare key my grandfather had given me years ago. Richard had never changed the locks, probably because he never imagined I would return here looking for anything important. The house was dim inside, illuminated only by the streetlight outside the windows. Most of the furniture had been rearranged since my grandfather died. Richard had modernized parts of the living room, replacing several older pieces with newer ones, but some things remained untouched, including the staircase that led to the attic. I climbed it slowly. Each step creaked in the same familiar rhythm I remembered from childhood visits. At the top, the attic door stood slightly open, just as I had left it weeks earlier. Dust hung in the air as I stepped inside. The wooden beams above cast long shadows across the floor, and the same boxes still lined the walls. Old photo albums, tools, holiday decorations, and in the far corner sat the wooden chest where I had found the flash drive and camera. Laura's phone call echoed in my mind. They claim there's another recording. I walked toward the chest again and knelt beside it. The lid creaked softly as I lifted it. Inside, the same items rested where I had left them. The old digital camera, a stack of envelopes, several notebooks filled with my grandfather's handwriting. I carefully removed each item and placed it on the floor beside me. Nothing new. No extra drives, no additional memory cards. I checked the camera again. The battery was still dead, just as before. If another recording existed, it wasn't here. So why would Richard's lawyers claim it did? The question circled in my head as I sat there in the dim attic light. My grandfather had always been methodical. If he recorded multiple messages, he would have stored them together. Unless he wanted them found at different times. The thought made me pause. My grandfather had been many things: quiet, thoughtful, patient. But he was also careful with important matters. If he suspected someone might tamper with his will, would he leave only one piece of evidence, or would he leave something else hidden? I looked again at the notebooks. Most were filled with ordinary notes, gardening schedules, financial reminders, small observations about the weather. But one notebook near the bottom looked different. The cover was newer. I opened it slowly. The first few pages contained short entries about daily routines. But halfway through the notebook, one line stopped me. If you are reading this, you probably found the recording. My chest tightened slightly. I flipped the page. The next sentence was written in the same careful handwriting, but the truth is never only in one place. The attic suddenly felt colder. I turned the page again. Below the next line was a short instruction. Look where the clock stops. I stared at the words for several seconds. Look where the clock stops. A strange sentence. A puzzle. But my grandfather loved puzzles. Downstairs, somewhere in the house, an old clock had hung on the living room wall for decades. And suddenly I realized something. When I visited the house last month, that clock wasn't there anymore, which meant one of two things. Either Richard had removed it, or my grandfather had hidden something inside it, long before anyone thought to look. Part 17. The realization settled in slowly. The clock. For as long as I could remember, it had hung on the far wall of the living room, just above the narrow cabinet where my grandfather kept old letters and spare keys. A large wooden wall clock with a glass front and brass pendulum that swung back and forth with a steady, calming rhythm. It had been one of the first things you noticed when you walked into the house, and it had always been slightly wrong. My grandfather used to joke about it. Clocks don't measure time, he'd say. They measure patience. When I was younger, I once asked him why he never fixed it. He smiled and tapped the glass. Because sometimes the moment it stops is the moment that matters. At the time, I thought he was just being poetic. Now it felt like a clue. I closed the notebook and stood, brushing dust from my hands. The attic suddenly felt less like a storage space and more like a message left across time. If the clue meant the clock, then the clock mattered. And if the clock mattered, I needed to know where it was. I carried the notebook downstairs. The living room looked different than it had during my childhood visits. Richard's renovations had stripped away much of the house's personality. Sleeker furniture, lighter walls, modern lighting, but one thing was missing. The clock. I walked to the wall where it had always hung. The outline was still there. A faint square of darker paint surrounded by a lighter rectangle where sunlight had faded the wall over the years. And below it, 4 small holes where the mounting bracket had once been screwed into the wood. Someone had definitely removed it. The question was when and why. I checked the cabinet beneath the empty space. Inside were only a few scattered papers and an empty drawer. No clock parts, no pendulum, nothing. Richard had taken it. That seemed like the obvious answer, but something about the situation bothered me. If Richard knew the clock contained something important, why leave the attic untouched? Why leave the camera and the first recording behind? He would have destroyed everything, unless he didn't know what the clock meant either. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Laura, I answered immediately. Did you find anything? She asked. Maybe, I said. My grandfather left a note in one of his notebooks. What kind of note? I looked again at the empty wall. It says, "Look where the clock stops." Laura was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The clock from the living room?" "Yeah. That clock hasn't been in the house for months." My grip tightened slightly around the phone. "You know where it went?" "Not exactly," she said, "but I remember something from the estate inventory." "What?" There was a small list of items Richard moved to storage right after the will reading. Furniture he said he didn't want in the house anymore. "And the clock was on it?" "Yes." My heart started beating a little faster. "Where's the storage unit?" Another pause. Then Laura said the words that changed everything. "It's not a storage unit. It's a private warehouse, owned by Richard." Part 18. The word warehouse hung in the air between us. "Why would he move a clock to a warehouse?" I asked. Laura exhaled slowly. "That's exactly what I wondered when I saw the inventory." I walked slowly across the living room, staring again at the empty space on the wall. "Do you know where it is?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "Industrial district on the east side of town. Richard bought the building 2 years ago through one of his companies." Of course he did. Richard never put anything in his own name if he didn't have to. "What's inside it?" I asked. "Mostly business equipment, according to the records, but the paperwork is vague." I could almost hear her thinking on the other end of the line. Then she said quietly, "The hearing is tomorrow morning." "I know." "If the clock is there and it contains something your grandfather wanted hidden, that might be the second recording. Or something even more important. Can you get inside?" Laura asked. I looked around the empty house. The quiet suddenly felt heavier. "I don't know," I said honestly. "Then find out tonight." She wasn't wrong. If Richard suspected anything, the clock could disappear before the hearing. Whatever my grandfather hid inside it might vanish with it. "I'll call you if I find something," I said. "Be careful," Laura replied. "If Richard moved that clock, there's a reason." The call ended. For a moment, I stood in the center of the living room, listening to the faint sound of wind brushing against the windows. Then I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. The warehouse district looked different at night. During the day, it was busy with delivery trucks and forklifts. At midnight, it felt abandoned, rows of large metal buildings under dim yellow streetlights. Laura had texted me the address. The building was easy to spot, a gray concrete structure with a large sliding gate and a faded company logo painted across the front. Richard's Company. 2 security lights illuminated the entrance. No guards, no visible cameras. But that didn't mean the place wasn't monitored. I parked half a block away and walked the rest of the distance. The air smelled faintly of oil and cold metal. When I reached the gate, I tested it gently. Locked. Not surprising. I circled the perimeter of the building slowly. Most of the windows were high and narrow, too small to climb through. But near the back, I noticed something, a smaller service door. And beside it, a keypad. I stared at it for a moment. Richard loved predictable things. He reused passwords, reused security codes. My mind went back to the will reading 3 years ago. The date, the day everything changed. I typed the numbers. The keypad beeped once. For a second, nothing happened. Then the lock clicked open. I let out a slow breath. "Still predictable," I muttered. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open. Inside, the warehouse stretched into darkness. Rows of shelves, covered furniture, stacks of crates, dust floating through beams of dim overhead lighting. The place looked like a storage space for things Richard didn't want to throw away, but didn't want inside his house either. I stepped inside carefully. My footsteps echoed faintly across the concrete floor. Somewhere in this building was a clock my grandfather had left behind for decades, a clock that might contain the truth Richard was trying to bury. I moved slowly between the rows of stored furniture, old chairs, cabinets, paintings wrapped in protective cloth. Then, near the back of the warehouse, I saw it, the wooden clock, leaning against a stack of covered boxes. The glass front reflected the dim light above. The brass pendulum inside was still, and the hands on the clock face were frozen in place. 11:47. The moment the clock had stopped, my grandfather's words echoed in my mind. Look where the clock stops. I knelt in front of it and carefully opened the glass door. The hinges creaked softly. Inside, the clock mechanism looked untouched. But behind the pendulum, something was wedged between the wooden panel and the back wall of the case. A small black object. Another flash drive. My pulse quickened as I reached in and pulled it out. For a moment, I just stared at it in my hand. Then I heard something behind me. A sound. The soft scrape of a shoe on concrete. I froze. Slowly, I turned around, and standing in the dim light at the far end of the warehouse was Richard. Part 19. For a moment, neither of us moved. Richard stood about 20 feet away, half in shadow, his tall frame outlined by the weak overhead light. He wasn't surprised to see me. That was the first thing I noticed. If anything, he looked patient, like a man who had been waiting for a very specific moment. "Well," he said calmly, stepping forward, "that saves me the trouble of searching." His eyes dropped to my hand, to the flash drive. I slowly stood up, closing the clock's glass door behind me. The soft click echoed through the warehouse. "You followed me," I said. Richard gave a small smile. "You broke into my building," he replied. "Technically, that makes you the one who followed me." I glanced briefly toward the exit behind him. Too far. Even if I ran, he could reach the door first. "How did you know I'd come here?" I asked. Richard walked closer, his footsteps measured against the concrete floor. "I didn't," he said, "but I knew you'd eventually start asking questions about the clock." His smile widened slightly. "You always were curious." The flash drive felt heavier in my palm now. "So you moved it," I said. "You took it from the house?" "Yes. Why?" Richard stopped about 10 feet away, his voice lowered. "Because your grandfather was a suspicious old man." The words felt colder than the warehouse air. "He started acting strangely near the end," Richard continued, "writing things down, recording messages, locking rooms, hiding objects." His eyes flicked briefly toward the clock. "I assumed he might have left. Surprises. And you didn't want anyone finding them," I said. Richard shrugged. "I prefer to control what information becomes public." Of course he did. "That's why you forged the will," I said. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Not guilt, annoyance. "You still believe that story?" he asked. "I've seen the video," I replied. Richard laughed softly. "That video?" He shook his head. "You really think that proves anything? It proves Grandpa didn't give you the estate." "No," Richard said calmly. "It proves he said that." My chest tightened slightly. Richard gestured casually toward the flash drive in my hand. "And now you found another recording, haven't you?" I didn't answer. He didn't need me to. Richard sighed like a teacher disappointed with a slow student. "You know what your real mistake was?" He said. "What?" "You assumed I didn't know about the recordings." The words landed harder than I expected. "You knew?" I asked. "Of course." Richard stepped even closer now. "I found the first one months after your grandfather died." My mind raced. "That's impossible. It was hidden in the attic." "Yes," Richard said, "and eventually I searched the attic." His eyes sharpened. "But by the time I found the camera, the memory card was gone." A small chill ran down my spine. "You took it," he said quietly. I said nothing. Richard studied my face. Then he nodded slowly. "I suspected as much." For several seconds, the warehouse was silent, except for the distant hum of electrical lights. Then Richard spoke again. "You should give that to me." "No," I said. His voice remained calm. "You haven't watched it yet. I don't need to." "That's where you're wrong," he replied. Richard pointed toward the drive in my hand. "Because if it says what I think it says, you won't want anyone else seeing it." A knot formed in my stomach. "What are you talking about?" Richard's smile returned. Slow, confident. "Go ahead," he said softly. "Watch it." The confidence in his voice made something feel very wrong. "You seem very sure of yourself," I said. "I am." "Why?" Richard's eyes locked onto mine. "Because that recording," he said quietly, "isn't about me. The words hung there for a moment, cold, unsettling. "Then who is it about?" I asked. Richard tilted his head slightly. "You." The air inside the warehouse suddenly felt much heavier. "That doesn't make any sense," I said. "Doesn't it?" Richard folded his arms. "You've spent 3 years telling everyone I forged the will." "Yes. You've built an entire lawsuit around that idea. That's because it's true." Richard's smile sharpened. "Maybe." The way he said it sent a slow chill down my spine. Then he nodded toward the flash drive again. "Go ahead," he said. "Play it." My grip tightened slightly around the drive. Why would Grandpa make a recording about me? Richard's answer came instantly. "Because the real secret in this family," he said quietly, "was never about the will." My pulse quickened. "Then what was it about?" Richard looked directly into my eyes, and for the first time since I'd known him, he seemed genuinely amused. "Your grandfather," he said slowly, "was trying to protect you." My mind raced. "Protect me from what?" Richard stepped aside, gesturing toward the warehouse office behind him. "There's a computer in there," he said. "Let's find out." And something in his tone made me realize one terrifying possibility. Richard wasn't afraid of the recording. He was curious to see whether I was ready to hear what my grandfather had really left behind. Part 20. The warehouse office sat behind a wall of dusty glass panels. I walked toward it slowly, the flash drive still clenched in my hand. Richard followed a few steps behind me, calm enough that it made the entire situation feel unreal. If he was lying, he was doing it with remarkable confidence. And if he wasn't lying, then something about this recording was very different from what I expected. Inside the office, a single fluorescent light buzzed softly above an old desk. A computer sat in the center, already powered on. The screen glowed pale blue in the otherwise dim room. Richard gestured toward the chair. "Go ahead," he said. I hesitated. "Why are you so relaxed about this?" I asked. Richard leaned against the wall with casual patience. "Because the truth rarely works the way people expect." That answer didn't make me feel better. I sat down. The computer was older but functional. I inserted the flash drive into the USB port and waited as the screen refreshed. A folder appeared almost immediately. One file. Just like the first recording. My heartbeat picked up slightly. I double-clicked it. The video opened. For a few seconds, the screen stayed black. Then the image slowly came into focus. My grandfather appeared again. He was sitting in the same chair as before. Same room. Same steady lighting. But something about his expression looked different this time. More serious. More deliberate. He leaned slightly toward the camera. "If you are watching this, then the first message has already been found." I felt Richard watching over my shoulder. "Your Uncle Richard will probably tell you that this recording changes everything." My grandfather paused, as if choosing his next words carefully. He is not entirely wrong. I felt a small knot tighten in my stomach. The camera shifted slightly as my grandfather adjusted his posture. "This message is not about the will. It is about the person who will eventually discover the truth." My fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the desk. "Because if you are seeing this, then you are most likely my grandson. You." The words seemed to echo in the quiet office. And that means the moment I have been preparing for has finally arrived. Behind me, Richard remained silent. My grandfather looked straight into the camera. "There are things about our family that were never written in legal documents. Things that could never be solved in court." He folded his hands together slowly. "Your Uncle Richard believes the will is the most important matter, but the truth is far more complicated than that." My grandfather's voice softened slightly. "Many years ago, I made a decision that affected both of you. A decision I believed was necessary at the time. But it created a secret that has followed this family ever since." I could feel Richard's presence behind me, still completely calm. My grandfather continued. "If you are watching this recording, it means that the conflict between you and Richard has already begun, which means the secret has finally reached the surface. The room felt strangely smaller now. Your uncle believes the truth will protect him, but what he does not understand is that the truth will change everything for you as well. I slowly turned my head toward Richard. He met my eyes without flinching. Then I turned back to the screen. My grandfather leaned forward slightly. So before you continue your fight, before you take this matter into a courtroom, there is something you must understand. He paused. The silence lasted just long enough to make my chest tighten, because the will you are both fighting over was never the real inheritance. My pulse quickened. My grandfather exhaled quietly. The real inheritance is the truth about who this family actually belongs to. The words hit harder than I expected, and then he said the sentence that made the entire room feel suddenly unsteady. Richard is not the only person in this family whose name was changed. My breath caught. Behind me, Richard spoke for the first time since the video started quietly. "Keep watching." I turned back to the screen. My grandfather looked older in this recording than I remembered, but his voice remained steady. Because the truth you are about to hear will explain why your uncle fought so hard to keep this secret buried, and why he believed you would never discover it. My hand hovered near the pause button, but I couldn't stop now. On the screen, my grandfather finally said the words that Richard had clearly been waiting for. Because the day you were born, your last name was not supposed to be ours. Part 21. For several seconds, the room felt completely silent. The fluorescent light above us hummed softly, but I barely heard it. My attention stayed fixed on the screen, my grandfather's face frozen in the dim glow of the monitor. My last name was not supposed to be ours. The sentence repeated in my mind, refusing to settle into anything that made sense. Behind me, Ridge shifted his weight slightly but said nothing. On the video, my grandfather leaned closer to the camera again. If you are hearing this, then the secret I have carried for decades must finally be revealed. His voice had changed. Not weaker, but heavier, like a man acknowledging something he had avoided saying for most of his life. When your mother was young, she made a decision that frightened her. She came to me for help. At that moment, I felt my pulse pick up again. My mother had rarely spoken about her past. She died when I was 19, and most of her stories about family history had always been vague, unfinished, or carefully avoided. Your mother was not married when you were born, my grandfather continued. That part I already knew. But the next words were not something I had ever heard before, and the man who was your biological father could not be part of your life. I felt a cold pressure in my chest. Behind me, Richard remained quiet. Your mother asked me to help protect you, my grandfather said, so I made a choice, a decision that would bind this family together in ways none of us fully understood at the time. He paused again, looking directly into the camera. I gave you our family name. The words felt strange, even though I'd grown up with that name my entire life. To the world, you became my grandson. Legally, you became part of this family. My mind raced through memories, childhood holidays, birthdays in this very house. My grandfather teaching me how to fix a bicycle in the garage. All of it built on something that now felt uncertain. But your presence created tension inside the family from the beginning, my grandfather continued. Richard never agreed with my decision. I felt Richard shift behind me again. On the screen, my grandfather's expression remained calm but firm. He believed the inheritance of this family should follow bloodlines, not promises. My grandfather exhaled slowly. But I believed something else. I believed family is not defined by blood alone. The words landed with a quiet certainty, and that is why the will became complicated. The video paused briefly as the camera auto-adjusted its exposure. Then my grandfather continued. You see, the estate was never meant to be divided simply by ownership. It was meant to test something. My fingers tightened on the desk. Test what? Richard spoke softly behind me. Wait for it. On the screen, my grandfather answered the question almost immediately. I wanted to know which of you understood what this family truly meant. My heart beat faster. Richard believed the inheritance was his by right. And you, he said slowly, might believe the inheritance was taken from you unfairly. He leaned slightly closer to the camera again, but neither of you understood the real purpose of the will. The room felt colder now. The will was never about property. It was about character. My grandfather folded his hands together, and the conflict between you was the final test. I blinked slowly, trying to process the words. Behind me, Richard gave a quiet laugh. See, he said. I told you. I turned toward him. You knew about this? Richard shrugged. I knew enough. I turned back to the screen. My grandfather's voice softened slightly again. If you are watching this together, then the test has already gone further than I expected. Together? The thought made my chest tighten. Because if both of you have reached this point, my grandfather continued, then one final truth must be revealed. He paused longer this time, almost like he regretted what he was about to say. Because the man you believe is your uncle, he stopped. And for the first time in either recording, my grandfather looked genuinely uneasy. The man you believe is your uncle is also the man who knows who your real father is. The words hit the room like a shockwave. I turned slowly in my chair. Richard was no longer smiling, but he wasn't surprised either, which meant one terrifying possibility was becoming very real. Richard had known this entire time, and he had been waiting for me to hear it from my grandfather first. Part 22. The video kept playing. For several seconds, neither Richard nor I spoke. The only sound in the warehouse office was the faint buzz of the fluorescent light and my grandfather's steady voice coming through the speakers. On the screen, he looked older than I remembered, the weight of time visible in the lines around his eyes. There is one thing I must make clear, he continued. Your Uncle Richard did not create this secret. My eyes flicked toward Richard. He stood near the wall with his arms folded, his expression unreadable now. But he has known the truth longer than you have, my grandfather said. And he believed revealing it would destroy more than it would solve. I felt a slow tightening in my chest, because the man who fathered you was not someone your mother wanted in your life. My fingers rested lightly on the desk, but they felt strangely numb. Your mother asked me to keep his name hidden. Not because he was dangerous, but because the situation surrounding your birth was complicated. I could hear Richard inhale quietly behind me. Your father was a man whose presence would have divided this family permanently. My grandfather paused again, and in some ways, it already did. I leaned forward slightly, trying to read his expression. Your Uncle Richard believed that truth should never be hidden. But I believe protecting you was more important than satisfying his sense of justice. Behind me, Richard let out a quiet breath through his nose. The video continued. For years we argued about it. He believed the estate should follow bloodlines and documented heirs. But the truth was never that simple. My grandfather looked directly into the camera again. Because while you may not share our bloodline, you share something more important. You were the only person in this family who treated me like more than a source of inheritance. The words caught me off guard. You visited when no one else did. You listened when everyone else argued. You cared for this house when the others only cared about its value. I swallowed slowly. So when I wrote my final will, I created a situation that would reveal the character of both of you. The camera shifted slightly again. If Richard truly believed the estate belonged to him, he would protect it. If you truly believed justice mattered more than wealth, you would fight for the truth. And eventually, the truth would bring you both here. My mind struggled to keep up. So he planned all of this? I muttered. Richard answered quietly, more or less. On the screen, my grandfather continued, because the final inheritance is not the house, not the money, and not the land. He leaned forward again. It is the truth about who belongs in this family. The sentence lingered, and that truth can only be accepted when both of you finally understand something important. My grandfather paused again, his eyes softening slightly. The family you fight over only exists because of both of you. I turned slowly toward Richard again. He was watching the screen carefully now. Your Uncle Richard may not share your compassion, my grandfather continued, but he has protected this family longer than you realize. And you, he said quietly, have protected something Richard almost lost. My chest tightened slightly. Respect. The room fell silent again as the video reached its final moments. My grandfather looked tired now, but determined. If you're watching this together, then the test has reached its end. One of you must decide whether the past will continue dividing this family, or whether the truth will finally allow it to move forward. The screen flickered slightly, and then my grandfather said the final sentence of the recording. Because the man who knows your father's name is standing in the room with you right now. The video ended. The computer screen went dark. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then slowly, I turned around. Richard was still standing against the wall. His expression was calm again, but his eyes were studying me carefully, waiting. I stood up slowly. So, I said quietly, you know who he is. Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the desk and looked down at the blank computer screen. Then he said something I hadn't expected. Yes. The word felt heavy in the room. I swallowed. Who is he? Richard finally looked at me again, and the way his expression shifted made my stomach tighten, because the name he was about to say was someone I already knew. Part 23. Richard did not answer immediately. For a long moment, he simply studied my face as if measuring something. The silence stretched across the small office until even the faint electrical buzz above us seemed loud. You're sure you want to hear it now? He asked finally. The question irritated me more than it should have. You already knew I would, I said. Richard gave a faint nod, like someone acknowledging a predictable outcome. Your grandfather believed timing mattered, he said. He thought you should discover the truth gradually. That's convenient, I replied. Maybe, Richard said. Or maybe he knew you wouldn't believe it otherwise. I leaned against the desk, my arms crossed. Stop stalling. Richard looked toward the paused video file still sitting on the screen. You spent 3 years believing I forged the will, he said calmly. I still do. That belief pushed you to investigate, to dig, to question everything. That's what happens when someone steals an inheritance. Richard shook his head slightly. You still think this is about money. What else would it be about? He looked directly at me. Identity. The word hung in the air. You grew up believing this family rejected you, Richard continued. That I pushed you out to take everything. You did. Richard didn't argue. Instead, he said quietly, what if the situation was never that simple? My patience was wearing thin. You know my father's name, I said again. Just say it. Richard folded his arms again, leaning lightly against the office door. You ever wonder why your grandfather was so protective of you? He asked. I thought that was obvious. You thought he felt guilty. Yes. Richard shook his head slowly. That wasn't guilt. What was it then? Responsibility. The word made my stomach tighten again. What responsibility? Richard looked at the floor for a moment before answering. Because your father wasn't some stranger your mother met once. A strange unease crept into my chest. He was someone your grandfather knew very well. I said nothing. Richard continued. In fact, he said quietly, he was someone this family trusted. My mind started running through possibilities. Friends of the family, old business partners, neighbors, anyone who had been around during my childhood. But none of the names that came to mind made sense. Just say it, I said again. Richard finally sighed, like a man accepting that a conversation had reached its unavoidable end. Your father, he said slowly, worked for your grandfather. The sentence landed strangely. Worked for him? How? He managed several of the properties in the early years. I frowned. That doesn't narrow it down. Richard nodded once. You're right. He looked straight at me again. His name was Daniel Carter. The name hit me instantly, not because it sounded unfamiliar, but because it sounded very familiar. Too familiar. For a moment, I couldn't place why. Then the memory surfaced. An old photograph in my grandfather's hallway. A man standing beside him in front of a construction site. Both of them younger. Both smiling. The caption beneath the photo had read, "Daniel Carter, Project Manager, 1989. "I've seen that name," I said slowly. "Yes," Richard replied. "He worked with Grandpa. For many years, I tried to remember more details, but he disappeared," I said. "Grandpa told me he moved away." Richard's expression changed slightly. "He didn't move away." "What happened to him?" Richard hesitated again. That hesitation told me the next part of the story was worse. "He died," Richard said quietly. "When?" "Shortly before you were born." The room felt suddenly smaller again. "So I never met him," I said. "No." "Did he know about me?" Richard looked at me carefully before answering. "Yes." My chest tightened. "What happened?" Richard's voice grew softer. "He was involved in an accident." The word accident carried a strange weight. "What kind of accident?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced toward the dark warehouse beyond the office windows. Then he looked back at me. "The kind," he said slowly, "that destroyed your grandfather." My pulse quickened. "Why?" Richard studied my face again. "Because your grandfather believed the accident was his fault." A cold realization crept into my mind. "Fault? How?" Richard's expression hardened slightly. "Because Daniel Carter was driving your grandfather's car." I felt my breath pause. "And the accident happened on a road your grandfather told him to take." The implications of that statement slowly settled in. "Wait," I said quietly. "You're telling me?" Richard nodded once. "Yes." My voice came out lower now. "So the man whose estate we're fighting over also carried the guilt for your father's death," Richard finished. The warehouse seemed eerily quiet now. I stared at the blank screen where my grandfather's face had been minutes earlier. And for the first time since this entire fight began, the story felt far bigger than a forged will. Part 24. The office suddenly felt too small. I stared at the dark computer screen. My grandfather's last image still burned faintly into my mind. Daniel Carter. The name echoed in my head, dragging pieces of memory behind it. A photograph in the hallway. A dusty plaque in the garage workshop. An old toolbox with initials carved into the handle, DC. At the time, I had never asked questions. As a kid, you rarely noticed the names attached to the lives adults used to live before you arrived. Now every small detail felt like a missing puzzle piece. "You're saying my grandfather carried that guilt for 30 years? I asked. Richard nodded slowly. "He blamed himself for the accident," he said, "even though the police ruled it a mechanical failure." I turned toward him. "But you don't sound convinced." Richard didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer to the desk and rested one hand against it. "The official report said the brake system failed," he said. "And you think that wasn't true?" Richard shrugged faintly. "I think your grandfather never believed it." The room grew quiet again. I leaned back against the chair. "So that's why he took me in." "Yes, because he felt responsible." "That was part of it." "Part of it." The phrase caught my attention. "What does that mean?" Richard's eyes flicked toward the flash drive still sitting in the USB port. "Your grandfather didn't just feel guilty," he said. "He also believed he owed Daniel Carter something." "What?" "A future." The words were strange but deliberate. "He couldn't give that future to Daniel anymore," Richard continued, "so he gave it to you." I folded my arms slowly. "That doesn't explain the will." "No," Richard said quietly. "It explains why the will became complicated." I thought about the years leading up to my grandfather's death, the quiet tension during family gatherings, the arguments that stopped the moment I entered the room, the way Richard always seemed to look at me like I was both a problem and a responsibility at the same time. "You resented me," I said. Richard met my eyes. "Yes, at least he was honest, because Grandpa treated me like family, because he treated you like his heir." The distinction hung heavily in the room. And you didn't think I deserved it? Richard shook his head slowly. That's not entirely true. Then what is? Richard walked to the office window and stared out at the dim rows of furniture in the warehouse. I believe the inheritance came with responsibilities you didn't understand yet. I frowned. Responsibilities like what? Protecting what your grandfather built. I could do that. Richard looked back at me. Could you? The question irritated me again. You didn't give me the chance. No, Richard said. Your grandfather didn't. I paused. What do you mean? Richard leaned one shoulder against the wall. The will you saw 3 years ago wasn't the final version. My chest tightened slightly. There was another one? Yes. Then where is it? Richard nodded toward the computer screen. That's what you're still looking for. The words took a moment to sink in. You're saying the recordings weren't just messages. They were instructions. I glanced at the flash drive again. Instructions for what? Richard's expression grew serious again. For finding the real will. The air in the office seemed to shift. You're telling me the one presented in court wasn't the real one? No, Richard said calmly. It was the legal one. That makes no sense. It makes perfect sense if you knew your grandfather. I thought about the notebook in the attic. Look where the clock stops. A puzzle. Another clue. He wanted us to find something, I said slowly. Richard nodded. Yes? What? Richard looked directly at me again. The document that explains everything. And you never found it? No. Why not? Richard's answer came quietly. Because the final clue was meant for you. The words sent a strange chill through me. Why me? Because the only person your grandfather trusted to solve it. Richard gestured toward the empty warehouse around us. Was the one person who wasn't obsessed with the inheritance. I looked back at the flash drive again. You're saying this fight wasn't supposed to end in court? No. Then where was it supposed to end? Richard pushed himself away from the wall. He walked toward the desk and picked up the flash drive carefully, examining it like an object he had waited years to see. Then he handed it back to me. It was supposed to end, he said quietly, when you realized the truth about your father. I stared at him. And then what? Richard gave a small, tired smile. Then you'd know where to look next. My pulse quickened again. Where? Richard nodded toward the warehouse floor beyond the office. Back at the house. The house again. The attic? I asked. No. Richard shook his head slowly. The place your grandfather trusted more than anywhere else. I searched my memory quickly. The attic, the garage, the garden, the workshop. None of them felt like the answer. Then Richard said something that made the pieces suddenly shift. Think about the one room in that house, he said quietly, where he kept every important thing in his life. And suddenly, I knew exactly which room he meant. The library. Part 25. The word library settled into my mind like the final piece of a puzzle that had been hiding in plain sight. For a moment, I didn't say anything. I simply stared at Richard, replaying the image of that room in my head. The tall wooden shelves, the leather chairs near the fireplace, the long desk by the window where my grandfather spent hours reading, writing, or quietly organizing papers no one else was allowed to touch. As a kid, I had loved that room. It smelled like old paper, polished wood, and the faint scent of pipe tobacco my grandfather used years earlier. But as I got older, the library had become something else. Private, almost sacred. A place where conversations stopped when I entered. A place where important decisions were made behind closed doors. And somehow, through all the searching I had done over the past 3 years, I had never truly searched there. You're telling me the real will is in the library? I asked. Richard shook his head. I'm telling you the answer is there. That's not the same thing. No, he admitted, it isn't. I crossed my arms. Why didn't you look? Richard gave a quiet laugh. You think I didn't? The answer caught me off guard. I searched that room a dozen times, he continued. Bookshelves, desk drawers, wall panels. I even hired someone to check for hidden compartments. And you found nothing. Nothing. The warehouse office felt heavy again, So why would Grandpa hide something there if he knew you'd search it? Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. Because he knew how I search. The sentence lingered. And you search like a lawyer, he added. What does that mean? It means you look for documents. I frowned. And that's wrong. Richard gave a small shrug. It might be if the thing you're searching for isn't a document. The thought made my mind start running again. If it's not a document, then what is it? Richard didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked to the office window again, staring out at the dim warehouse rows. You spent a lot of time in that library when you were younger, he said. Yes. You ever notice your grandfather had a habit when he read? I thought back. 100 small memories surfaced. Grandpa sitting in the chair near the fireplace, turning pages slowly, writing notes in the margins of certain books, leaving small folded papers between chapters. He marked things, I said slowly. Richard nodded. Yes, and he never threw books away, I added. Exactly. The idea began forming before I could fully articulate it. You think he hid something inside one of them? Richard turned back toward me. I think he left a trail. A trail through books? That's how he taught you to think, didn't he? It was true. When I was a teenager, my grandfather used to give me puzzles hidden inside novels. He would underline certain words across different pages, forming secret messages if you connected them correctly. At the time, it felt like a game. Now it sounded like something far more deliberate. So the real will might not even look like a will, I said. Richard nodded once. Now you're starting to understand. I looked down at the flash drive again. Then what was the point of all the recordings? To make sure you came back. To the house. Yes, a slow realization crept into my mind. You never wanted the recordings destroyed. Richard shook his head. No. Then why move the clock here? To keep it away from the lawyers. That answer made sense. If the recordings became part of the legal case too early, the entire puzzle might collapse before its final piece appeared. So tomorrow's hearing, I said. Richard finished the sentence, is probably irrelevant. I leaned against the desk again. You're telling me we've been fighting in court over a will that might not even be real. That's exactly what I'm telling you. A strange mixture of frustration and admiration filled my chest. My grandfather had orchestrated this entire conflict. Every clue, every hidden message, every step pushing both of us toward the same conclusion. You knew all along he was doing this, I said. Richard shook his head slowly. I suspected, but you couldn't solve it. No. Why not? Richard looked directly at me again. Because the final step wasn't meant for me. The room fell quiet again, and for the first time since discovering the recordings, I realized something unsettling. If the final clue was meant for me, then my grandfather had expected me to come back to that house eventually, not as a visitor, but as someone ready to uncover the truth. Richard pushed away from the window. Well, he said calmly, there's only one way to find out if we're right. I already knew what he meant. We go back to the house, I said. Yes, tonight. Tonight. Richard checked his watch. We have about 6 hours before the hearing. That enough time? Maybe. I picked up the flash drive and pulled it from the computer. The screen went dark again. As we stepped out of the office and into the massive warehouse space, I glanced once more at the old clock standing quietly in the shadows. The hands still frozen at 11:47. The moment my grandfather had chosen to stop time. But something told me the real moment he had been waiting for was about to happen back in that library. Part 26. The drive back to the house felt longer than it should have. Richard sat in the passenger seat of my car, quiet for most of the ride. The city lights faded behind us as we moved through the older neighborhoods where the streets grew darker and the houses farther apart. I kept thinking about the library. All those years I had walked into that room without realizing what it might actually contain. Do you remember the last time you were there? Richard asked suddenly. A few weeks ago, I said. Before that. I thought for a moment. Before Grandpa died. Richard nodded slowly. That's about the same for me. The house appeared at the end of the road just as the clock in the car rolled past 2 in the morning. The porch light still flickered. The oak tree beside the driveway swayed quietly in the night wind. For a moment, neither of us got out of the car. Then Richard spoke. If he really left the answer here, he knew we would eventually come together to find it. I didn't respond. Instead, I stepped out and walked toward the front door. The spare key still worked. The house welcomed us with the same quiet creak of old floorboards and faint smell of aged wood. But tonight it felt different, like it had been waiting. The library door stood at the end of the hallway. Dark, closed. I pushed it open slowly. The room looked exactly the way I remembered, tall shelves lining every wall, hundreds of books arranged in careful order, the leather chair by the fireplace, the large wooden desk beneath the window. Richard stepped inside behind me. Where do we start? I asked. He glanced around the shelves, with the place he always started. I knew the answer before he finished the sentence. The chair. My grandfather's reading chair sat exactly where it had always been. Beside it was a small table with a brass lamp and 3 books stacked neatly on top. I walked toward it slowly. 3 books, all worn from years of use. Richard leaned slightly closer. You recognize them? Yes. I picked up the first one, a copy of The Count of Monte Cristo. My grandfather loved that story. A man falsely accused, a long fight for justice. It felt strangely appropriate. The second book was To Kill a Mockingbird, another story about justice, another story about truth. And the third book, I froze slightly when I saw the title, The Old Man and the Sea. 3 books about patience, justice, endurance. Richard noticed my reaction. What is it? I opened the first book carefully. Inside, a small line was underlined near the beginning of the chapter. Not a sentence, just 2 words. Wait patiently. My pulse quickened. I opened the second book. Another line underlined. Truth arrives slowly. Richard leaned closer now. Check the third one. I opened The Old Man and the Sea. Halfway through the book, a single phrase was marked with a pencil line. When the fight is over. 3 fragments. Wait patiently. Truth arrives slowly when the fight is over. I looked at Richard. That sounds like the court case. He nodded slowly. Yes. The fight. The lawsuit, he agreed. I felt a strange realization forming. You think he meant the will only appears after the case ends? Richard's expression tightened slightly. That's exactly what I think. My chest sank. The hearing is in 4 hours. Yes. And if the real will appears after the fight, Richard finished the thought quietly, then everything we're doing right now might be premature. I looked down at the books again, but something about the underlines felt incomplete. My grandfather had never made puzzles this simple. There's more, I said. Richard watched as I flipped through the pages again. The underlined phrases were only part of it. On certain pages, tiny numbers were written in the margins. Page numbers, references. I followed the first number back through the book, page 147. The sentence there had another faint mark, a single letter. Then another page, another letter. Richard leaned closer as I began writing them down on a piece of paper from the desk. 6 letters. When I finished, I stared at the word they formed. My heart skipped once. Richard, I said quietly. He looked at the paper, and for the first time that night, he looked genuinely shocked, because the letters spelled one word. Garage. I looked up slowly. The workshop. Richard exhaled slowly. Your grandfather built half the house in that garage. Yes, and he trusted no one else in there. The realization hit both of us at the same moment. The library hadn't been the final location. It had only been the map. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk drawer and headed toward the hallway. Richard followed close behind. The garage door creaked loudly when I pushed it open. The familiar scent of motor oil and old wood filled the air. Workbench, tool cabinets, old blueprints pinned to the wall. Everything looked untouched. For a moment, we just stood there. Then Richard pointed toward the far corner. A large, wooden workbench stood beneath the window. The same bench where my grandfather had taught me how to repair engines. How many times did you work with him there? Richard asked quietly. Hundreds. I stepped closer, running my hand across the surface of the wood. Then I felt it. A small indentation near the back edge, a hidden seam in the wood panel. My pulse quickened. I pressed gently. A soft click echoed through the garage, and a narrow compartment inside the workbench slowly slid open.